I'm delighted to be able to say that our topic this evening is Hitler Emigrés in Ireland and Northern Ireland, those who came and those who could not. The speakers are Gisela Holfter from Limerick and Noel Russell from Belfast. They will explore what happened to the refugees from Germany and Austria who applied to come to the Irish Free State and Northern Ireland from 1933 onwards, but were refused entry. The stories of these successful applicants who were admitted, and briefly the contributions of those who came, including some admitted after the Second World War. Gisela is Professor of German and Director of the Centre for Irish German Studies at the University of Limerick, a Fellow of the Centre for British Studies at Humboldt University, Berlin, and a member of the Deutsche Akademie für Sprache und Dichtung. Her monographs include Erlebnis, Irland, and others. In particular, an Irish sanctuary, German-speaking refugees in Ireland, 1933 to 1945. Noel Russell, our other speaker this evening, is a journalist and TV producer and a former news editor of the Irish News and editor of Speech Radio, BBC Northern Ireland. His book, The Saved and the Spurned, Northern Ireland, Vienna and the Holocaust, was published by New Ireland Books in 2024. And that is a book that you might be interested in. I don't know if anybody watching through Zoom can see that. So I'll just repeat the title. It's The Saved and the Spurned, Northern Ireland, Vienna and the Holocaust, published by New Ireland Books in 2024. And it's now my pleasure to welcome you and to proceed with our talk. Thank you very much. I'm sorry about the disappearing act, but it's easier and I don't want to trample over people.
Thank you very much, Jana. For this very kind introduction, and it's wonderful to be here and to see so many of you here. And this is the first time that Noel and myself are doing this kind of double act, so we haven't practiced that in depth. It's going to be a kind of world premiere, and I think we're looking forward to it, aren't we?
We are some apprehension, but we're generally.
Yeah, I think that was absolutely what I'm thinking too. So what we thought we'd do is to split it up into 3 parts so that you hear us alternating, hoping that this might make it a bit more lively and that you don't fall asleep hearing me in the beginning. You wouldn't fall asleep with Noel anyway, but we thought that might work. And so I'll start with the part on those who could not come and policy question in the 2 jurisdictions. And then we go on and cover at least some of the people who could come, and then we will briefly say something about the people who could not. If you have any urgent questions, just ask them at any stage, and otherwise there will be a chance to ask questions afterwards. Does it sound fair enough so far? Yes, brilliant. Then we will go on, and I think if we have just some context, I didn't anticipate the top line, so you might not see that, but don't you worry. It just says some context, the Irish Free State side. And I think it is always important to go back to the time and to kind of consider what were the circumstances at the time. And I think what is really important to keep in mind for the Free State was that it was a very recent independence, only since 1922. and there were quite a few economic turmoils, never mind the political one. After the acceptance of the Anglo-Irish treatment by majority, there was a civil war in Ireland. So really until 1924, it was a very turbulent and difficult situation, and it didn't immediately improve for quite a while. And I think this is really important as background for Ireland. That led to very high unemployment, and that led to very high immigration rates. And the immigration rates actually increased in the 1930s. Ireland is sometimes called the Isle of Exile because so many people went into exile. Of course, starting from, not actually starting from, but you all will have heard about the Great Famine in the middle of the 19th century, which led to about 2 million people from originally 8 million people leaving and more than dying. In the 20th century, there would have been 3 decades of very high immigration. The 1950s, where, and unfortunately, I'm not very good with numbers and I tend to forget them very quickly, but an unbelievably high number of university graduates knew that they would never get any employment and left. The second highest rate of immigration was in the 1930s and then in the 1980s. So just to say that among the numbers in terms of actual numbers who would have left Ireland, the Free State, in the 1930s, in the middle of the 1930s, there would have been about the same as from Germany, given vastly different population numbers, just as a background. The other thing that should be mentioned is that the Catholic Church had a very special position, and that was actually enshrined in the Constitution, Benracht nach Herren. And what should also be mentioned is that in 1937, when that constitution was passed, there was explicit recognition of the Church of Ireland, the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, the Religious Society of Friends of Ireland, as well as a Jewish congregation and other religious denomination existing in Ireland. And when this was created, people were discussing it. Eamon de Valera, who was at that stage Prime Minister, what is nowadays called the Taoiseach, he would have consulted with all the religious leaders, including the chief rabbi, for this constitution was passed. So just as background, in 1937, when this wasn't always the case, Ireland would not have been the most hospitable country for refugees. And that policy was there from the beginning. And this is an exchange from the Berlin legation, with headquarters in Dublin about anyone wanting, well, especially people who were not German citizens, but, for example, Polish Jews who lived in Germany and wanted to know whether Ireland might be an option for immigration. And somewhat proactively, the legation said that they discouraged such a person from going to Ireland as they are really only refugees. Just checking back with Dublin, is that the policy we want to follow? And the answer from the Department of External Affairs, as it was called then, so the Department of Foreign Affairs, I'm directed by the Minister to inform you that he approves of the action which you are taking as regards Jewish refugees desiring to come from Germany to the Irish Free State. As far as possible, such persons should be discouraged from coming here. So that was April 1933. So just to say that was kind of the starting point. And you might have heard about Charles Bewley, the Irish minister in Berlin, and who had definitely anti-Semitic tendencies. That was before he came. So this is not all due to Charles Bewley. This was kind of policy beforehand. I would also like to say that looking at people who did not manage to come, and I think if I remember correctly, more or less, looking through all the Department of External Affairs files and any others we could find in the archives, there were about 1,500 applications, so not 10,000 of applications. And of these, about 450 or so were granted, and not all of them came. And others who didn't apply did come. That's a different story. So there would have been no straight, clear policy that you could follow from the files of the people who were either rejected. There were sometimes no forms or no answers or no replies or no comments on the file, so we don't quite know what the answers were. But overall, there was a very negative perception of anyone who could become a burden. And I would like to stress that this wasn't only towards refugees, that was even towards people who were born in Ireland, had gone to the United States, become United States citizens, and then wanted to come back. And if they couldn't show that they had family support or that they had any kind of way of supporting themselves, they were not necessarily permitted to come back. So just as a general framework, anyone who could add to a potentially difficult, well, to an actually difficult situation was seen as a potential burden, and therefore there wasn't much interest. And I would say you could, there was a quite skeptical or negative outlook on people who wanted to come, and probably it would be fair to say there was a particularly skeptical outlook towards Jewish refugees. So there was a change in policy in 1938, and that of course also had to do with the Anschluss in Austria. There were far more requests of people coming, and I think that was taken more serious, probably. Austria was a Catholic country, Ireland was a Catholic country. There were probably more direct links. And there is in a way a nice story, because there was a decision by the Senate of the University Council Dublin to accept students and professors from Austria. And the Department of Justice happily would have said, no, we don't do that. That's kind of against our policy. Unfortunately, the one who was the Chancellor of the University College Dublin at the time happened to be Eamon de Valera, who was also the Prime Minister. So he had actually spoken in favor of that. So there you had the Department of Justice being disposed towards that. But they couldn't do anything about it, because they couldn't argue with the Prime Minister of the time. And he had said that he was favoring a more sympathetic approach. And the other really important thing of development at that stage is the coming together of the Irish Coordinating Committee for Refugees. There had been refugees or 8 committees already earlier, but this one was really decisive, and it had the support of the government. And if they said they wanted someone to come, that person could come. And initially, the idea was to grant permission for 90 people, 50 for agricultural training, 20 guaranteed adults, so that meant someone else needed to give a guarantee, and 20 guaranteed children. And also initially concentrating on the so-called non-Aryan Christians. And of course, I don't need to remind you that November 1938 is of course also the time of Kristallnacht, and then also the Kindertransport. So in that moment, or just before that committee had been formed, so overall we counted over 400 people who came to Ireland as refugees, at least for some time, and that is not counting visitors who would have come there for a while. So that's the part now on the Irish Free State, and I happily pass on to Noel.
Thanks, Gisela. The Northern Ireland story is more contained in one sense, but also more disparate. I'll concentrate on the research that I did into the Austrian people who came to Northern Ireland, because Until late 1944, they were the biggest group who made it to Northern Ireland. There were more Austrians and Germans who made it to Northern Ireland. And behind me, you'll see a 2-paragraph news article that appeared in the Zionistische Rundschau, which was the only Jewish newspaper that was allowed to be published in Vienna after the Anschluss. Eichmann had closed down all 8 Jewish newspapers immediately after the Anschluss. This created even more chaos than was already existing given the persecution. So he reopened the paper that had previously been called the Jüdische Rundschau, and he called it the Zionistische Rundschau. That was a sign that he wanted to force the Jewish population of Austria out of the country as quickly as possible. It had articles about the advantages of going to Palestine. It had Hebrew lessons. As the months went on, it even had columns listing people who wanted to get married to try and get a way of escaping Austria. Austria was the first country in Europe to be occupied by the Nazis. It was invaded in March 1938, as most of us know. Immediately the Nazis invaded, they imposed extreme persecution. Jews were forced out of their jobs, they were forced out of their accommodation, and they were in danger of being attacked on the streets. Within weeks of the Anschluss, 5,000 men had been sent to Dachau. A number were murdered on the trains going to Dachau. Some were sent to Buchenwald. So Vienna was a laboratory for persecution, and it's been called a laboratory for genocide because the measures introduced in Vienna were introduced by the Nazis throughout occupied Europe. That was persecution, isolation, expropriation, deportation, extermination. That's a so-called Wiener Modell. And, that's why Vienna is extremely important in the story of the Holocaust, even if the numbers killed there were not as great as those killed in Hungary and Poland and elsewhere. So this little article followed several months of persecution. The Jewish population of Vienna numbered about 185,000. There were about 10 to 15,000 Jewish people living in the rest of Austria, but by far the biggest population in Vienna, about 9% of the city. The third largest Jewish population in Europe in terms of cities after Warsaw, Budapest, bigger than the Jewish population of Berlin, I've read. So, important place. Vienna was a cultural center, but it also had suffered extremely badly in the 1930s and the 1920s. It had had booms and busts, and there was a lot of unemployment throughout the 30s. When Eichmann took control of the SS in Vienna, largely, he wanted to force as many people out as quickly as possible. Jews were forced to queue to try and get visas to get out, but they had to have a place to go to, and they had to have a sponsor. For example, if they went to the UK, they had to give assurances that they had the money to get out of the UK. So this little article appeared in the Zionistische Rundschau. It said that the Northern Ireland government had given funding and support to an Austrian Jew to set up a factory to train local people. The unemployment rate in Northern Ireland was by far the highest in the United Kingdom. It was almost 30%, between 95,000 and 100,000 workers unemployed. The Stormont government in Northern Ireland had introduced a scheme called the New Industries Act in December 1937. The purpose was to create jobs for unemployed local people. It was not a humanitarian rescue scheme, it was a job creation scheme for Ulster people. So, as soon as this little article appeared, it said, for example, the Stormont government is giving grants for employers who can open factories. It's prepared to pay workers 10 shillings a week, and it's prepared to listen to applications from both employers and skilled professionals who can act as trainers. It said it had it had allowed this Austrian Jew to bring 7 people from Vienna to train. This man, this Austrian Jew, was a very important figure in the Ulster story. He was a man called Alfred Neumann. In a way, he was Ulster's own Oskar Schindler, because he did more than anyone else to get Jews out of Vienna. So this little article is finished by saying the Northern Ireland linen industry has been in operation for more than 200 years, and some of the founders were refugees from Huguenot France. The Huguenots helped to set up the Northern Ireland linen industry. So immediately it appeared, August the 26th, 1938, hundreds of people applied overnight from Vienna to Belfast. A small group of civil servants in the Ministry of Commerce had the job to decide who got in and who didn't. They were very strict in applying the rules, and the rules were basically, if they were convinced that an applicant could open a factory and employ local people, you got in. If they were convinced, however, that your application was in some way conflicting with people already employed, you had no chance of getting in. And if you applied on your own in a desperate bid to get out, the chances of getting in were very slim. Some people applied outside the scheme because they had contacts. Some people wrote to the rabbi in Belfast, a very key figure in the story called Rabbi Jacob Schechter. They wrote directly to him. And he had good contacts with the Stormont government, and he was able to bring some people out. He was also a very careful preserver of his own authority in the Jewish community. And that led to some difficulties with 2 key figures in the story. One of them, Alfred Neumann, I've just mentioned. So August 38th, people are applying. The civil servants are looking at the applications. They're picking some as winners, but rejecting the vast majority. So you have perhaps a 1 in 9, 1 in 10 chance of getting in. In total, there are about 1,000 names in the letters. Those include children of applicants, foremen named by the applicants. They include people applying from every walk of life. People who had several factories across Europe, people who were engineers, doctors, musicians, fashion designers, photographers, textile workers. So anybody who thought they had a chance applied. This is what they wanted to escape from. This is a day or two after the Anschluss, and these are Jewish men on the streets of Vienna scrubbing with a bleach called lye, a very toxic bleach. They've been ordered to remove pro-independence slogans from the streets of Vienna. There had been a referendum planned on the Sunday, I think March the 12th, because the Chancellor von Schnusnik thought that he could win a majority to preserve Austrian independence. He had been called by Hitler to Berchtesgaden the previous month. Hitler berated him for 2 hours, insisting that he install Nazis in the cabinet, free any Nazis that were held in detention, and insisting that there had to be changes. He returned, discussed it with his advisors, and decided that he would, out of the blue, declare a referendum, confident that he would win it, and that would preserve Austrian independence. Hitler, obviously we heard this, gave the go-ahead for invasion, and they invaded on a Friday night. It was said that the population of Vienna could go about their business on the evening of Friday. People went to the cinema with the red and white flags of Austria streaming. When they came out, the Nazis had taken over the streets, and the world had changed utterly. So that was Vienna in 1938. Hundreds applied. The civil servants looked very carefully and decided who got in. Some did get in. For example, a man called George Bloch. His father was a Polish Jew based in Danzig. His family got out on the last train from Warsaw, and they came and opened a factory in Portadown called Ulster Laces, which at its peak employed 700 people. So these people were small in number, perhaps 100 employers and foremen got out at this stage anyway, and they created jobs for several thousand people in the coming years. And some of these firms lasted well beyond the war. They lasted for several decades. So I'll hand over again now to Gisela, and we'll talk about when she came to Ireland.
So I'm just mentioning a few people, also due to the fact that we have family members here. So whenever I say something wrong, I know I can rely on you to correct me. I wanted to make sure to cover different areas, and that worked beautifully because we have family members here from of Ernst Wilhelm or Willy Königsberger, and who became the director of Lauder. Okay, sorry. And would have been, and I'm going to say a bit more because that fits best with the Northern Ireland part, there were a number of industries set up with the factories, by the factories, and not quite as structured, I would say, in Northern Ireland, but there were, and I will show a map in a moment. There were also a number of children who came to Ireland by themselves. No comparison whatsoever to what happened in Northern Ireland, and Noel will talk about Millile Farm, and will mention the many children who came with the Kindertransport also to Northern Ireland. I only know of one boy who came via the Kindertransport to southern part of Ireland, and in fact he had come to England, and the story that he told me was that he had complained that the food wasn't very good, and his mother had contacted the bishop and he was sent to Ireland. I have no idea whether this is true, but he did end up in Ireland and he did end up with a priest. It wasn't a very happy situation because it seems that the priest was an alcoholic and his main job from then on was to get whiskey in different places. He did make, he had a very interesting life, and in fact he has published a book about it. So I can recommend it. But Lisa Fischer, and I have a photo of her here, came with her half-sister from Vienna. And for me, that is a very special story because I was given her diary from 1938, 1939, and in fact 1939 to be precise. And it started in German, and then as soon as she went, and she was 14 years old at the time, it went on to English immediately. So she's a very gifted girl. And I got a lot of photos of her and her diary. And then I was very lucky after the book was published. I got an email from her grandson saying, like, imagine my emotion when I got a photo of my grandmother, when I saw a photo for the first time. She had died when giving birth to twins, and the father had married again, and the twins weren't told for a long time that that wasn't their real mother. And they never, when they did hear, they thought, okay, anyway, there's a long story. So they didn't really want to follow up, and it was only actually thanks to Brexit, in inverted commas, that the grandson then inquired about nationality and citizenship, and somehow came across that on the internet, the book. So I was very happy to write the diary and the photos to the family. And that was the story of Lisa Fischer. There were a number of academics who came, and one of them was Professor Hans Sachs, and his grandson here. And another one was an eminent lawyer, Dr. Ernst Scheier, and we have his grandson here as well. And I forgot to mention that we have the granddaughter of Willy Königsberger here as well. So they are in a much better position than myself to answer any questions about their family. There were quite a few academics who came to Ireland. They did have actually good contacts too. There were far fewer in Northern Ireland. Paul Peter Ewald would be the one who came to my mind immediately. And he would have worked together with his colleagues at the Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies. The Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies was actually set up by Eamon de Valera in 1940, and he headhunted Erwin Schrödinger, who had got the Nobel Prize in Physics for it, and who then led the physics part, and then later got Walter Heitler, another physicist, over another refugee physicist, and then there were several others who also worked there. So that would have been a key contact. They worked also together with Max Born, a relative in Edinburgh. So there was a very strong connection in terms of science, and there was a great interest in science. It was there that Erwin Schrödinger gave his lecture, What is Life? And was of huge interest to the Dublin public. And maybe I should also add the Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies was a slightly unusual institute of research. It had two main areas, physics, and the other one was Irish, the language. So Irish language and physics had to do, of course, with Eamon de Valera's interests, because he was a math teacher and was really interested in physics, and he was very strongly of the view that Irish was a very important part of the Irish culture and Irish. So, and it's still like that. Well, they added meteorology also by one of the refugees who came to Ireland. This map shows you now the economic development, and if you look around it, it's almost like a circle in the periphery of Ireland, because Ireland is very centralized. Everything is centralized in Dublin, and you can see that everywhere where, well, you could argue Tralee should have been mentioned as well. There was actually a refugee who was the director of a factory there, but the ones that were newly set up were Plunder and Pollack, Tannery, Le Mode Moderne, there was hats, women's hats, and the Wings, a zip factory, Western hats, men hats, and Hirsch ribbons who came from Jana. So they had, I think, the same idea as this was supposed to give employment in areas where there hadn't been any industry. And when we went, so the book that was, that will hopefully give you a lot of information on the Exile of Ireland that I had on an earlier slide, was written by my colleague Horst and myself, and we traveled around quite a lot, Horst Dickel, and we went to Longford, and they said, we met some lovely elderly people. They said, if that factory hadn't come to Longford, we would have emigrated. We had no other chance. It was the only employment that there was. So it did really have an impact, and it did, just as what Noel said about the industry in Northern Ireland, it didn't give employment to thousands, but Western Heads alone, I think, gave employment to about 300, and they lasted until the 60s and sometimes the 70s. So it did have a real impact in terms of industry. So I'd also like to mention just very briefly some other people who came, and from the beginning, from 1933 onwards, there were a number of medical doctors, some of them actually very established, especially in Berlin. And they came to Ireland for, you would say nowadays, like a one-year conversion course. With this degree, which most of them got in Trinity College, they then could work anywhere in the English-speaking world, basically. So it was very important. And while the Department of Justice was fully aware that these were refugees, but who had the means to support themselves, they had no problem with that, because it was for a limited time and they knew they would move on. So there were quite a number who came. There were a number of researchers who came, helped by another academic, Robert Ditchburn. And then there were two people I like to mention, because unlike Northern Ireland, where you had more artists as well, there was only really one musician I know of, and that's Kurt Roger, and he did compose his Irish sonata, and it's a lovely story because he played it in Waterford with a young Belfast woman, and when they fell in love, he went off to America to exile there, She followed him after the war, became a viola player with the American Symphony Orchestra. And this Irish sonata is, in a way, the kind of love story between them. And I had the lucky situation that I did meet her, and wonderful woman. Annette Kolb is also a special case because Ireland as a refugee destination, as a refuge, as an exile destination, was not researched for a very long time. And until the 2000s, you find remarks in publications that list refugees who came to Ireland, like 20 from this country or 50 from there. And then it says, but no one was let in from the refugees in the Nazi period. And I thought, this is, can't quite believe that. And I think one reason is that there were no writers. Like there was a lot of interest in early exile studies, researching the situation about well-known German writers, and there wasn't really anyone who came to Ireland except for Annette Kolb, and she was, you will find, well, you might, but I didn't, we didn't find any file about Annette Kolb in any of the archives, not in the military archives, not in the national archives, not in any of the others. So that's, we found lists of people who came on all the different ferries, so never a word about her. I find it fascinating, but that's the way it is. There might well be others, but so far I haven't heard of anyone else. And we've published the book 10 years ago, so I'm so far fairly proud. But she's one who would have been very well known at the time, but she wouldn't have been seen as a refugee who came. So the reason why she came is that she had a sister who had married an academic in Cork. He was professor of English there. And she was a very interesting one because she already went into exile in the First World War because she was a pacifist. And she had a French mother and a Bavarian father. So that was the story about Annette Kolb. I think that is my part on this, and I'm happily talking to you again.
You see a picture now. This is taken from a Northern Ireland newspaper in August 1938, just before the Zionistische Rundschau had published its article, this little 2-paragraph article about the Northern Ireland scheme. So it was already known and people were applying. These were the first group who came to a factory in Newtownards. You'll see 6 people in the front row, 5 women, 1 man. On the right of the photograph, the back is a man, or I've mentioned, Alfred Neumann or Oscar Schindler. The other man in the back row is a member of the Northern Ireland government. He was the London agent of the Ministry of Commerce, a man called James Stewart, and his job was to encourage employers like Alfred Neumann to come to Northern Ireland. Now, this was taken on a sunny day in Newtownards, where this factory was opening just outside Belfast. The newspaper report said 7 people had got out, but you'll notice in the photograph that only 6 are pictured. And that's because one of the 7 had got to the railway station in Vienna, but was picked up by the Gestapo, was arrested and was not allowed to go. So that gives an idea of just how perilous the situation was for Jewish people in Vienna at that time. These people worked making handicrafts in a factory, soft toys and things like that. Initially, about 40 people were being trained. The factory was going well. They got very good publicity in the local press. Then, in early 1939, things started to go wrong. Alfred Neumann, according to a memo in the files at the Public Records Office, had differences with staff. We don't quite know exactly. The file is a bit obscure. Just said differences with staff, and the Northern Ireland government withdrew funding, which was, you know, a big surprise and a big shock after the fanfare. Alfred Neumann had also partly opened a factory in Derry with a man called David Gilfillan. In November 1938, it was going well. The thing seems to go bottom up in Newton Ards. The factory stopped work for a while. Within months, though, it started again because a couple from Vienna who had worked in the clothing industry, a woman called Annie Lewinter, who was a very skilled fashion designer, had opened her own fashion shop and studio in Vienna several years before, at the age of 21. Her husband was a Hungarian who had come to Vienna called Zoltan Frankel, and he was not only a brilliant, charismatic salesman, but he was a connoisseur of modern art. And they came, took over the factory in the early part of 1939, and it started to blossom. When war broke out in September 39, the factory was switched to making parts for uniforms and other things, part of the war effort. So what happened to Alfred Neumann? Well, in September 1939, the British government ordered a register list of all so-called enemy aliens. These were Italians, Austrians, Germans, anybody who had come to Northern or to come to the UK from the continent or had even been resident for years. It included people like Italian waiters, restaurant owners, and many of the refugees who had got to the UK fleeing Nazi Germany, Nazi Austria, who were dedicated opponents of the regime. They were considered enemy aliens. There were three categories. In December 1939, Alfred Neumann was arrested and interned initially in a camp in Essex, and then he was taken to a place called Wharf Mills, which was in Lancashire, a former mill, which was a terrible place. Some of the refugees who were taken there said the conditions in it were worse than Dachau. There were hunger strikes at the camp.
Nobody was killed at Wharf Mills. My uncle was at Dachau. I don't think you can say that.
That's a quote now I've read from a resident. I'm
Questionable.
not saying
I
it,
don't
but
think you should say that. That if you say Dachau is no worse than Wharf Mills, I wouldn't say that.
okay, I'll take your point. I'm just quoting what a resident said. Well, there were hunger strikes, sir. There were hunger strikes.
Read many memoirs, including Karl Jakobsthal's memoir of Wharf Mills, which was very unpleasant, I agree, but nobody was killed there. You can't say that of Dachau, even before the outbreak of war. Sorry.
No problem. No, I won't dispute. Thanks for the clarification. Anyway, the mill was soon closed and the people were taken to the Isle of Man. So 30,000 detainees were taken to the Isle of Man. And in 1940, after Dunkirk, at the time of Dunkirk, the British government panicked and they thought an invasion of the UK was imminent. And Churchill is supposed to have uttered the phrase, collar the lot. So Germans, Austrians, Czechs, Italians were interned on the Isle of Man in camps on the Isle of Man. In July, it was decided to send Category A prisoners across the Atlantic to Canada. And a ship left Liverpool. I think it was the second ship of 4 to go in July, called the Arandora Star. It had been a former cruise ship, quite a luxury ship, had been turned into a troop carrying ship, and then it was used to transport prisoners to Canada. July the 1st, it left Liverpool, sailed up the Irish Sea, turned left and headed towards Canada. It was spotted by a German U-boat, and the captain, Gunter Preen, had already sunk 8 ships in the North Atlantic in a 2-week period. He had one torpedo left, he fired at the Arandora Star, and it sank within an hour. 800 men on the ship lost their lives. The rest were rescued that day by a Canadian destroyer, taken back to Glasgow, and within days they were brought back to Liverpool and put on another ship called the Dunera, which was sent down the Irish Sea, heading towards Australia. A U-boat in the Irish Sea spotted the ship and fired 2 torpedoes at it. Miraculously, the torpedoes missed and the ship was able to sail on. The conditions were terrible on the ship. Soldiers had assaulted the detainees, robbed them on the quayside. They were, within days, the bilges were swimming in urine and feces because the toilet facilities were totally inadequate for the detainees. And this is attested. And they finally got to Australia. An inquiry was held by the British government. The detainees, after being taken to the centre of Australia, the warmest places on the continent, were compensated. A Jewish lawyer who was in the British Army called Julian Lanyon carried out the inquiry. One guy who was not murdered on the ship, but when he heard that they were having to sail down the Atlantic, he jumped overboard and was drowned. So that was the Isle of Man, and that was what was happening on the ship. Back in Northern Ireland, the businesses that had been set up by the Jewish Emigrés did very well. I mentioned George Block. His family employed 700 people in Northern Ireland. They were making laces for ladies' underwear, and they were making other lace garments. And that survived until the 1980s, when it was basically undercut by foreign imports. Just cheaper to buy this stuff in the Far East, so the factory had to close. The Jewish employers who came to Northern Ireland were known as non-sectarian, fair employers, which was not always the case in Northern Ireland, it has to be said. Obviously, these families had experienced sectarian hatred in their own countries, had experienced race hatred, and they were acutely aware of the terrible effects of that. So they had very good reputation as employers. This is a picture of the Northern Ireland Prime Minister, Basil Brooke, Viscount Brookborough. He's attending a factory in a town called Srigley, a little place outside Downpatrick. It's called United Chrome Tanners. It used to be a linen mill. The Northern Ireland linen industry had basically collapsed in the 1930s. It was being overtaken by cotton manufacturers as well, and it was a long, drawn-out, laborious, dirty process to make linen, and the market fell out of it. So this factory was turned into a tannery, and at its peak was employing 400 people. The family were Czech Jews called Utitsits, and they had set up the factory in 1940 under this scheme. So also in County Down, there was a farm set up by the Jewish community at Malile. And in the back row here, you'll see the third key figure I'm going to talk about. It's a man called Franz Kohner. He's in the back row. He was a Czech lawyer from Brooks in Western Czechoslovakia. His family had connections with the linen industry in Northern Ireland, and that probably helped him get the job of managing this farm. It was opened initially in July of 1939 to accommodate kinder transport children from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and altogether about 300 people came to the farm, mostly teenagers, and they transformed the 70 acres of the farm into a very productive area, producing all kinds of vegetables that they were able to use for themselves and to sell on. Kohner was a very distinguished guy. He was a Central European intellectual. He had defended left-wing causes in Czechoslovakia. He had defended miners. He got out with his wife. Again, he couldn't get his parents out. They were killed in the Holocaust. He had made a success of the farm. In Easter 1941, the Luftwaffe bombed Belfast in 4 raids, and quite devastating raids. 2,000 people were killed. 50,000 houses were either destroyed or very badly damaged. Some of the Jewish community went down from Belfast. Their area, which was in North Belfast, was badly hit, and a number of people came down with the rabbi to stay at the farm while the bombing continued and while the area had been devastated. One Friday evening, Franz Corner was typing up ration card applications and correspondence with the authorities for the people who had come. And as a matter of courtesy, he went to the rabbi who had his own room and said, I'm sorry if my typing disturbs you, but I have to apply for these as quickly as possible. And according to Franz Corner's memoir, he said, the rabbi turned to him and said, I curse you, I curse you, I curse you. Now, this is Corner's version of the events, and that caused a rift between Corner and the rabbi. He continued working at the farm, but he was rather disheartened and alienated by this, and he stayed there until 1943, when himself and his wife started a small business making children's clothing. It expanded, and they opened a factory in West Belfast between the Falls and the Shankill, between Catholic, the Falls, Protestant Shankill, which did extremely well. It was burnt down in the Troubles in August 1969, and a couple of years later, Franz Corner died. His son, Billy, and his daughter, Ruth Corner, opened the factory in another place in White House, just in the north of the city, and it was a successful factory again until the 80s, when foreign imports more or less made it difficult to continue. I'll just take you back somehow to the crony letters and some of the people who applied, some who didn't get in. This is a couple called Otto Kies and his wife Herta. They had applied from Vienna, and they were rejected. I think he had a career as a small businessman. I'll need to check my notes. They were rejected anyway. They were taken to Latvia. Otto was murdered within 3 months of arrival at a camp outside Riga. Herta and her daughter Vera survived the camp and survived 2 other camps and survived the war. And I think they went to North America afterwards. So that was just the risk that you were running if you couldn't get into Northern Ireland. Between 125 to 150 people were admitted out of about 700 names in the files. Now, there are references to other people in the files, but about 125 to 150 were killed after being sent to the east from Vienna. So that's just to bring you up to date. I should say, mentioning the factories in Northern Ireland, 2 men in this room have done sterling work in bringing to public knowledge the great work that was done by the Jewish Emigrés, Bernie Englander and Stephen Jaffe. It's called belfastjewishheritage.org, and I'm happy to give the link. But if anybody wants to further interest in what happened to those who came and what they did, this is a marvelous research tool. So I'll hand over again now to Gisela, and she will talk about what happened and what the contributions were of those who came, including some after the war.
So very briefly, as we said from the beginning, I wanted to mention also for people who, in the unlikely case that you read the book in detail and you wanted to hear a few new names, these are some new ones, and I was also inspired to some extent by Joe Wieselski, who died, Ireland's oldest man, and who was the captain of both the Czech and then later the Irish table tennis team. And he was a long-time coach, and he also was the oldest student of Trinity College. I think he went back in his 90s to university, and so I thought that's inspiring maybe for some of us, including myself. And just to kind of give an idea that also after the war, quite a few people came from very different areas. Agnes Benell, you might have heard of. She was quite a big. My father was a playwright in Berlin, and she became a performer of Brecht songs in Ireland, for example. Tommy Reichenthal is still with us, and he's one of the most important people now in Ireland, telling his story and going to schools and universities. Hermann Brück was the astronomer who came and then became royal astronomer in Edinburgh afterwards, but he came to Ireland first. Gerhard Bersu, archaeologist, he became like Ernst Levy, who had come already in 1936, a linguist who was also teacher of Walter Benjamin. So Gerhard Bersu and Ernst Levy became professors of the Royal Irish Academy. The story is that Ernst Levy heard about that from the newspaper. He didn't hear about it otherwise. Peter Keim-Kaudel, a sociologist, and Elisabeth Friedländer, so many things that when I gave a paper here 8 years ago, I heard about her for the first time. So I wanted to mention her as well. And the two I very briefly wanted to point out because I was fascinated by their story. One of them is Karl von Metzrath, with C or with a K. He was a teacher at the very first Waldorf school in Germany, Stuttgart, in 1919. He was in exile in Great Britain in 1935, survived with language teaching. He moved to Ireland in 1948, and then he founded Ireland's smallest school. There's a lovely newspaper article. There were 4 pupils, including his own son. And just to kind of show the Waldorf influence, there are quite a few Steiner schools now. And so I'm not totally sure. I haven't been able to link that up all very clearly, but I just thought it was fascinating. And then Martin Hauser, I'm sorry that you can't see the top there. He had been in Dachau concentration camp, and then he came to Ireland after the war. And it was just this kind of, he was someone who did artificial jewelry in Ennis and in Limerick. And it just, I thought the newspaper article about him was fascinating. It's a far cry from the South Sea Island to Limerick on the River Shannon. Yet today, the city of the broken treaty can boast one thing in common with the Blue Lagoon, that's spelling, sorry, mistake, on the Pacific Pearls. And so there was this picture of the 50 girls who got employment there, putting together jewelry and earrings and so that's gone on. So just to kind of recap, overall, what are the impacts of the refugees who came? Definitely the Aliens Act 1935 was created also in mind with people who came and in a way to kind of differentiate and to keep people out. Definitely also the Irish Jewish community, especially the progressive Jewish community that was founded not least by the refugees who came, and Stephen's parents were the first couple who got married there. The academic contributions, not only in the Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies, but also in Trinity College, in UCD, the Royal Irish Academy, and then the industrial development that I showed, and of course the ongoing Irish-German and Irish-Austrian relations. There has been a very late start to the research of that, and the problem is a little bit that therefore we lost a lot of testimonies and a lot of stories. There was a public apology then in 2003 by an Irish minister. So overall, it's a little bit too soon to say anything about the people who came after the war. I mean, there were far fewer. And interestingly, when we did the research on the refugees, quite often we heard, oh, yeah, I know someone, there was, my family took someone in, and it invariably turned out to be a child from Operation Shamrock. That was a scheme after the Second World War that brought about 300 to 400 children to Ireland. And that is really quite established in the memory in Ireland. And there are a lot of links, far more than to the refugees. And there were also a handful of Nazis who came to Ireland afterwards. There was also Prince of Saxony who came, and a number of very colorful people. So overall, I would say it does need more research. So if anyone feels inspired, there is still a lot out there. So, Noel, over to you. Oops. There.
In Northern Ireland, after the war, very few people came. In 1944, the largest group to come to Northern Ireland as refugees were from Gibraltar. 7,000 people from Gibraltar were transported from London during the V2 rocket attacks on London. They were moved to Northern Ireland. 250 of these people were Jewish, and they stayed in various camps in County Antrim and County Down. Initially, they were relieved to escape the bombings, obviously. Afterwards, the conditions were very cold, very damp. They wanted really, as soon as the war ended, to get back home. But many of them didn't return until late 1947. They weren't allowed to work, so they were short of money. Some got occasional sort of black market working with local farms and things, but not much. It was very difficult for them. In terms of contributions, I'll mention just a couple of people. I mentioned Annie Lewinter and Zoltan Frankel. They made a great success of the factory in Newton Ards. At one stage, between 300 and 400 people were employed there. And Zoltan Frankel had acquired over 80% of the pictures that were used by the Arts Council in their initial exhibitions in the 1940s. He was a brilliant collector of art. He knew the poet John Hewitt, and they together basically built up the Northern Ireland Public Art Collection. I interviewed his daughter Vivian in The Other Man, and a couple of years before I interviewed her, she sold a painting by Jack Bees for almost £1.5 million. Her house was full of paintings by Jack Yates, Jared Dillon, Stanley Spencer, and others. So he's a brilliant connoisseur of art. In Derry, people had gone and worked in the shirt industry. There were guys like Ludwig Schenkel, who set up a factory making handbags and leather goods and uniform flashings during the war. He stayed for more than 40 years. He stayed until his death. Very few people who had come to Northern Ireland went back to Germany or Austria. He took over 10,000 photographs in Derry, Donegal, even in Israel. A marvelous collection of photographs in Ireland in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So people like that, they made a contribution not just to the economic life of Northern Ireland, but a very significant contribution to the cultural life. The rabbi stayed for at least until the 50s, if I recall. He was a distinguished man, a very distinguished Talmudist, and an expert on children's literature, secular literature. He wrote essays. So a very cultured man. Although he locked horns with people on some occasions, no denying the great contribution he made to the country. Politically, the Jewish community got on very well with the authorities. They were they stayed as a group out of politics, but instinctively they were pro-unionist rather than pro-nationalist. They had been educated at most schools. People have been educated at Protestant grammar schools and Catholic grammar schools, but they felt themselves fortunate to have got into the UK, and they weren't in any way anti-British. I should mention that some people who had come to the Irish Free State did come to the north and made a life there. Robert Weil had come as a refugee from Germany, and he had studied at Trinity College, Dublin, modern languages. He was an expert in German literature, particularly Goethe, and he came north and worked as a teacher and later as an examiner of German. I remember him coming to my own school. He was a very distinguished man. He was one of the key examiners for A-level German and university German. So those exiles probably influenced the culture more than they realized, because they were a kind of cosmopolitan nucleus in a country which was bitterly divided along religious lines. And they transcended that, and their contribution was greatly outplayed their numbers, given their role in the country. It was entirely beneficial. So that's what happened. What?
Do my disappearing.
Right.
What was the name? Can I start questions? Sorry, I jumped in there.
Someone said that they.
Actually, Jana, oh good, just in time, my question. Refugees were interned, actually, were they?
Sorry?
Czech.
Yes, there were some.
There were some,
There
but
were
it was
some.
not a general, yes.
Not
You mentioned them in the list.
They were in the minority.
Yeah.
Yes.
But we're very interested in the industrial project, and so what you mentioned in terms of entrepreneurs coming and so on, it was part of a bigger picture, wasn't it? The special areas. And in our latest yearbook in the research centre, we have 3 chapters devoted to exactly these very interesting projects in Wales and the North East and so on. So I'm very interested in that. But what I really wanted to ask was, so it wasn't the same in Ireland. So when you showed that lovely map with the hats and the ribbons and so on, so that wasn't part of a scheme, that was just individuals who managed to come and...
A mixture. I mean, Jean Lemas, who was the minister in charge of industry, he would have been very supportive of these schemes. So you could say there was state directed idea, but it wasn't the same as with this one scheme where it was more like haphazard approach, I would say.
Okay.
Yes, there was also a kind of scheme with individuals who were connected.
Yeah. And I don't want to be greedy, but I do have another question. What happened during the war with Ireland being a neutral? What implications did that have for the refugees?
The implication was that they weren't interned. So none of the refugees in the later republic, in the Free State, was interned. They some of them did find employment, so you could apply to the Department of Industry and Commerce, and you got work permits. You didn't need to have a work permit for language tuition and agricultural support, but otherwise you did need, and more did get the permission, especially, of course, if they could offer employment to others. But otherwise, they were supported by the Irish Coordinating Committee for Refugees or the Jewish Committee, and they were at that stage together. But they had their own, like the Quakers had a big group who looked after. So it did, in the end, fall down to the individual groups to look after their people they had brought in.
I just wondered, was there not resentment, that the Irish were not attacking the Nazis? This was a big thing in Britain that, although it was very ambivalent, they felt that they felt that Britain was, helping to defeat their murderers. But that was not the case in Ireland.
With all the discussions I've had with, unfortunately, most of them have passed in the meantime, there would have been always a great gratefulness and a strong reluctance to speak out with anything negative about the country.
Makes sense.
So I think that was a key element.
Some of the internees some of the refugees who came to Northern Ireland, the evacuees, were interned firstly in prison in Belfast. About 35 Jewish men from Austria, Germany, were interned in the prison, and they were taken to the Erlebnis, and about 10 or 15 women were put in prison in Armagh, and one of the women, a Quaker called Margaret McNeil, went into the prison with them and stayed for a while. They were released after some months, But the people who were taken to the Isle of Man were very bad, because when they came back to Northern Ireland, it was very difficult for them to get work, to get their jobs back if they were already working. So
Yes.
it wasn't a particularly. There's a diary by a woman called May Woodside, who worked with one of the refugee support organisations, and she had close contacts with the refugees who were interned and who came back. And
Yes,
there were small numbers, but obviously, if you were in the Isle of Man for a couple of years and you were categorised as an enemy alien.
yes, these stories are also covered in our yearbook as well. Yeah, there's a lot of literature on.
Well, the Northern Ireland School was based on the Special Areas Act,
Yeah.
but the Northern Ireland government benefited from the Special Areas funding because it had autonomy, so it had to set up its own act. But it complained because even the embassies on the continent was not doing much to advertise Northern Ireland, even though it was part of the United Kingdom. They had difficulties getting their message out, which is why the sort of article in the Zionistische Rundschau was important. It went directly to the Jewish community in Vienna.
Still on the topic of internment, which is endlessly interesting, of course, I wonder if you're aware of the Worth Mills project, initiated by somebody based in Manchester called Richard Shaw. They had a wonderful website, and it was based very much on sort of first-hand accounts, etc. And of course, you're absolutely right, it was appalling. The British government should have been ashamed of themselves, but it was not Dachau. But that aside, I mean, if you want, I could put you in touch. I think the website is no longer actually online, which is a real shame. But I can put you in touch with Richard if you would like.
Find out more about that.
Yeah.
It's a huge
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm interested in how they actually got to Northern Ireland. I mean, there wouldn't have been any charter flights. You can't get a train.
They went the standard route. They could have Germany, Austria, and then they went by train across through Holland, often to the Hook of Holland, and then got a ship to Harwich,
And then they come through the UK.
and then they got the train to Hesham, which was a ferry port near Liverpool, and they got the boat to Belfast, and some went
Or
by.
Dublin.
No, the ones who came within the UK did not go to Dublin. They came.
But what about the ones who went to the Irish Free State? How did they get there?
They probably went to Liverpool and could sail to Dublin that way.
Right.
Because there was a ferry route across.
That must have posed problems because they came through the UK. It can't have been a simple journey.
Well, first of all, they had agreements between as it is still, you can travel normally, they have travel permits, but quite a few came actually directly from Germany and went to Cork, or Cove, or Queenstown as it was then. So that would have been, and some actually did fly. So if you read George Clare, Last Waltz in Vienna, he describes his flight over to England, and then the boat from England. So that did happen.
There's one story I should mention. A man called Otto Goldberger had a shirt factory in Vienna, and he finally got a visa to come to Northern Ireland. He had a sister in Derry called Frederica working in a shirt factory, because that was the centre for shirt industry. But when he got to London, he thought he was going to Londonderry, which was the British name of the city, but he thought Londonderry was a suburb of London. And then he thought he could get a bus to it from the centre of London. Then he had to realise he had to get the train to Heysham, cross the Irish Sea, and get a train to Derry. So he got there in the end.
While we have a pause, if there are any questions, please, from our Zoom audience, please do say. Open your microphone and ask. Yeah. No, it seems not. Sorry, you had a question.
Yes, thank you to Gisela and Noel. It's really interesting to hear what was happening in Ireland and Northern Ireland. I was interested in Lisa's diary, and very nice to hear that it was reunited with family members. Can you tell us a bit about what she wrote in her diary? For example, in the German section, before she
arrived?
It wasn't like an outpouring of feelings or anything like that. It was mainly meeting with the youth group, singing. She must have been quite musical, so it was mainly like appointments rather than anything else. But I just thought it was so impressive that she switched over from German to English straight away after her arrival.
So she was a child doing her normal things and putting them in her diary. There wasn't an indication of a difficult environment or a difficult future.
No, we have. This is quite a strange story somehow how I got the material in the first place. There was an article in the Irish Times saying, and no one was let in, and that was kind of the usual story. And I wrote a letter to the editor and said, look, the number of refugees who were taken in by Ireland is not large, but to diminish it to that extent, we think at that stage, I thought there were about 300, and to diminish it and say just there were a handful or 20 means not only diminishing their achievements and impact, but also the people who helped them. So I got a letter afterwards from someone with a kind of paper cutting saying there were 2 articles on it from 1947. I think Many More Races, Great Success, and Death of Mrs. E. Lynn. And I wasn't quite sure what either of them had to do with me. And it turned out that was actually Mrs. E. Lynn was Lisa Fisher, who had married Ernest Lynn, but you wouldn't have known from the names. The names of the mourning family was an English one, English sounding names. Her half sister Erica was spelled with a C. So and then it turned out that had been sent to me by the daughter of Lisa's best friend. And not only did she send me the diary and photos, but also the last letters she wrote before her death, where she writes that she doesn't want to call the doctor because she doesn't want to be told off as having the first baby. And so very moving. And that was quite special. And then I tried to find out more about Lisa Fisher. Fisher is not the most unusual name. I was told that the father had been a high-ranking lawyer in Vienna. He wasn't. But by chance, I found some uncatalogued boxes in the archive in Vienna and had then letters and could actually put everything together, and so could give the family also the address where their mother had come from. But I had sometimes luck. There's nothing else.
You mentioned the issue of neutrality. I should give a couple of facts. Although the official policy of the Irish Free State was neutrality, about 65,000 men joined the British forces, which was roughly the same number as those that joined from Northern Ireland. So there was no official bar on joining armed forces, and up to 200,000 Irish civilians from the Republic, or the Free State as was, came to Britain to work in factories and farms. Obviously, high unemployment, but they came, and there was no bar on that either. It was probably best described as active neutrality. There was any Germans who were captured, if their planes crashed in the Irish Free State, were interned. Any British planes that crashed in the Irish Free State during the war, their crews were discreetly handed over to Northern Ireland. So it was, and also there was no conscription in Northern Ireland. It was only part of the UK, as far as I'm aware. There wasn't conscription because of the controversy that had been in the First World War. In 1917, the British planned to introduce conscription. There was mass opposition amongst nationalist Ireland, which didn't stop, it didn't stop several tens of thousands of Irishmen joining the British forces.
You mentioned, I can't remember which one it was, Northern or the Irish Free State, that the settlers, the refugees, were largely pro-unionist.
I said that. Yeah. In the north I'm talking about now. This is the north, it's in a 6-county state.
Why would that be?
Well, they felt grateful to have been admitted by a government which was entirely unionist. It was effectively a one-party state. So they felt that their loyalty was to the state that had brought them in. I can't speak, Gisela can speak about the south. Many of the people, for example, who came to the farm at Malay wanted to join the British forces as soon as they could, and some of them did. And it has to be said that both Catholics and Protestants in the north joined British forces. You know, it was accepted that there's a bigger picture here, and at a time of high unemployment, you had an added impetus to join an organisation like an army where you could get a living wage.
Yes.
But instinctively, I think the Jewish community felt at home here in the north. There was no major outbreaks of anti-Semitism. I think their experience was largely positive in the community. Any of the Jewish descendants that I spoke to told me that.
Did they settle in certain areas in a ghetto, or were they spread about?
Well, there were parts of North Belfast around the synagogue, and then a new synagogue was built in the 60s, but the population after that started to decline with the Troubles. But there were Jewish people in smaller numbers throughout Northern Ireland. Biggest second group was in Derry, Londonderry, and then you had other groups in Lurgan, Portadown, other parts. If you go to the Belfast Jewish Heritage, you'll see all this in glorious Technicolor.
Are there any more questions?
Jana, you won't mind if I mention some forthcoming online talks that might be of interest given the subject of today's session. I'm the founding director of an organisation called Insiders Outsiders, which some of you may already have come across. It's dedicated to celebrating the contribution of refugees from Nazi Europe to British culture across the board, but the emphasis is very much on culture, the arts. And just by chance, in fact, Bernie and Stephen are very much responsible for this. My interest was whetted by a talk that I was alerted to that they had given a few months ago. And since then, we had Michael Lewis talking about his recent book on his parents, one of whom his mother was Helen Lewis, the famous dancer, modernist dancer, choreographer. And I'm planning a whole cluster of events to coincide with this year's Refugee Week in June. And if I can just quickly mention, there's Gina Pierce, who Anna and I were recently introduced to at the Metropolitan University here in London, who's done some research on somebody called Henry Nathan, who was in the textile bin. That's anything to you. And then we've got Pamela Aviard, who's going to be talking about the friendship between Helen Lewis and Alice Berger-Hammerschlag. And then we've also got somebody called Philippa Robinson. I don't know whether you've come across
Yes, I know
her.
Philippa.
Exactly. So anyway, but if you're interested, if you go to the insidersoutsiders.festival.org website and sign up for the newsletter, you'll be kept informed, or come and talk to me if you'd like.
I do have one more question, if I may. And that's when I read the title of today's session, I immediately thought, yes, this must be about Jewish refugees, but I simultaneously thought that there could be some inclusion of social democrats, political opponents of Hitler, who might have been part of the refugee contingent as well. Is that the case, or is that not the case?
Certainly in Northern Ireland, Franz Kohner was a social democrat, and there is in Czechoslovakia in particular, there seems to have been a social democratic left-wing tradition amongst the exiles. A family called Langhammer came and they set up a factory at White House just outside the outskirts of North Belfast, and they were Czech socialists. His son Mark Langhammer was an independent Labour councillor in Newnabbey and Belfast, so they had a reputation for being left-wing throughout the Troubles.
But Jewish or non-Jewish?
He was non-Jewish, but
right.
Franz Kohner was Jewish, and he had defended social democrats in Czechoslovakia, in Western Czech, a place called Brooks, I think it was, B-R-U-X, and he had defended miners who were in court for, pro-Labour activities. So there was a small number, but most of those who came in the letters that I studied were not politically active, and I think if any were, they perhaps were inclined to keep quiet about that because that wouldn't have helped their applications if fairly conservative civil servants were judging them. I imagine saying you were an active socialist mightn't have got you into the UK in a hurry, I think.
Sorry. I pricked up my ears when I heard the name Matthias Kölz. He was not Jewish. He was a fervent anti-fascist, although he had some very interesting relationships with the Nazi regime, but he was an extraordinary painter, an artist, but not Jewish.
The political. Unfortunately, Professor Brinson was on the Zoom, so she is our expert, perhaps, in the research centre on the political emigres. But many of them were Jewish and left wing.
Yes.
It's really important to remember.
But they were an important small part of the some 18,000 who came there. Yes.
But most of them, I would have thought, yes. Would have been Jewish left wing.
Not necessarily.
Sorry?
Not necessarily, no.
There were some pacifists.
The Nazis.
Very
Anti-Nazi with being left wing.
Just a small point on Jewish views of Southern Ireland from my grandparents' experience. I think on the one hand, you know, they regarded the newly independent Free State much in the way as they regarded all kinds of other small countries that had arisen in Europe as a result of the First World War, you know, the newly independent parts of what had been the Austro-Hungarian Empire. On the other hand, my grandfather was a bit perplexed by finding that after any concert in Trinity College, Dublin, they played God Save the King.
But Trinity College was seen as a unionist institution.
Oh, yes, it was a
That's why they played
Boston Kingdonist.
They wouldn't have played that at University College Dublin.
Wouldn't have done that. No, I quite agree.
I think we must close. I'm sure we could continue for some time with so many related points. But thank you both very much indeed and for answering so openly and questions that people have asked. It's been really, really interesting and illuminating, I would say, to have the contrasting aspects and approaches, perspectives this evening. Each one of you, of course, has valid points, important points, but to be able to juxtapose them in this evening has been really special, and it's something that I wanted to focus on for some time. And I'm delighted that it looks as though this evening will lead to other events that I hope you will both be involved in. I know you can read what's up there, but for the benefit of people watching through Zoom who may not have that so clearly, could I mention our next event, please, which is on the, lost it. 25th of March at 6 o'clock. Yes. And it's called, no, this is for the benefit of people on Zoom. The title is Never Give Up, Female German Anti-Fascists and the Rise of Hitler. And it will be in this room. So please do feel welcome to join either in person, which would be tremendous because your questions also stimulate other questions and open the discussion. If you can't make it, it will be on Zoom, open on Zoom also. And thank you very much indeed for coming, and sincere thanks again to you for coming all this way from the Emerald Isle.
For having us.
And we hope to see you again soon.
Yes.
Thank you very much.